Starting off with number 10 is Mercenaries, the last game of which was Mercenaries 2 World in Flames, which came out on August 31st, 2008. Now, Mercenaries Playground of Destruction is just a fantastic game. It came to us from Pandemic Studios. It was a sandbox game. Came to the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox, the original Xbox. It's kind of an insane story. It takes place in North Korea. But to boil down the mechanics, you're obviously a mercenary, and you have to quote-unquote verify targets. And now what that means is you either kill the target and take a picture, or you subdue the target and airlift them. Most of the time, you get way more for capturing them than you do for killing them. And then it also has something to do with cards that I'm not going to get into. If you remember the game, you know what I'm talking about, and you know that if I explain that, I'm going to be talking for a while. It's not particularly complex, but it sounds complex because it has to do with different suits and yada yada. You get the point. The sequel was a little rushed. It wasn't quite as good. It kind of just felt like plopping the mercenaries into another controversial country, Venezuela this time. And they kind of tonally shifted it from a kind of oppressive looking game to a more colorful game. Because Venezuela is, as you know, a somewhat tropical country. And this was a game that got delayed a lot, like multiple times a year between 2006 and 2008. And allegedly EA Studios forced a basically unfinished release of the game. And keep in mind this was on PlayStation 2, 3, and Xbox 360, which yes, did have internet access. Not so much the PS2, but the PS3 and the 360. But patches weren't really a normal part of console games at this point. They did actually put out a free patch, which kind of also functioned as its first DLC. Added 6 new characters, co-op, and actually cheats, because this was still back in the era where some games still had some kind of cheats. But it was a kind of a case of too little too late. It wasn't a good enough game by the standards of the first. It certainly wasn't as bad as a lot of critics called it, but it wasn't something that captured the magic of the first. There was a third one planned, but it got shelved due to the performance of the second. Reputation wasn't very good. Sales weren't as good. And yeah, that kind of sucks. They changed up the mechanics a little bit, and it didn't work out. And as you know, Pandemic Studios was another example of EA just like brutalizing a great developer. And number 9 is Final Fight, which in some ways was kind of actually the inspiration for Streets of Rage. It came out a couple years earlier, and in arcades, it's Capcom. I mean, Capcom knows fighting, and this is a fantastic series of games. The last release was Final Fight Double Impact in 2010, which is just a compilation. The actual final game was Final Fight Streetwise, which was a game, like you could definitely call it that. I don't really know how Streetwise exists. It really should not have been called Final Fight anything, even though it actually continues the story of Final Fight 3. It really just does not live up to what Final Fight was, though. Final Fight was a fantastic series. Just really nailed the 2D beat-em-up. Kind of defined it in a lot of ways. I remember playing all the originals for the Super Nintendo back in the day. And, like, the thing that sucks is Streets of Rage had a 4th entry that came out recently, and it's great. Like, it's a really good game, but it also makes you go, I wish they'd do this for Final Fight. I don't know, Capcom's been listening to fans a little bit more in recent years, so maybe sometime we will see a new traditional style Final Fight game in the vein of Streets of Rage 4, right? It could happen. I hope it happens. And number 8 is the True Crime game series, which includes Sleeping Dogs, even if not officially. So, True Crime was a pretty different open world game. It's kind of like the counterpart to Grand Theft Auto, in that in a True Crime game, you played as law enforcement. There were 2 games, True Crime Streets of LA in 2003 and True Crime New York City 2 years later. Now, the mechanics are very similar to Grand Theft Auto 3 and Vice City. They're not very different at all. So it got a little bit of flack for that being called a clone. However, like, the premise of it is the opposite, and the worlds that they're built in are actually very good. They did a great job making an LA and a New York City that work really well in that console area. Very detailed, very cool looking. And True Crime New York City actually didn't get reviewed that well, nor did it sell very well. Still, it was a good game. I actually liked True Crime New York City a lot. I liked Streets of LA a little bit more, but later down the line, Activision hired United Front Games to develop True Crime Hong Kong, Activision canceled it in 2011, Square Enix decided, hey, that sounds like a good game. So they picked up the rights, removed all the connections to the True Crime series, and released it as Sleeping Dogs in 2012. Honestly, Sleeping Dogs is probably the best of the three. It's really a good game, a very different game, because it certainly does resemble Grand Theft Auto in a lot of ways. And it retains the fact that you're on the other side, the police side, but combat is much more like hand-to-hand. There's a lot more martial arts, there's some parkour, yes there is some shooting, but not nearly as much as in the previous games. And honestly, at this point in time, I would love to see, I don't care how, but a sequel to True Crime or Sleeping Dogs. And number 7 is Legacy of Kain. Now this goes way back to PlayStation 1. The first game was called Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, and I just remember it being a very different game. It was a top-down action-adventure game, and it was good, but I was really brought in more by Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver in 1999. Now, the game isn't radically different from the 2D version, but it's 3D, and it really becomes much more interesting in 3D. It's a game that really benefits from the shifting perspective, because it lets you go between both the spectral realm and the material realm, which is two different versions of it. It's kind of a good way to handle dying, because you shift to the spectral realm before you can go back to the material realm. Kain, the protagonist of the first game, is actually the final boss of Soul Reaver. And it gets a little more complex in Soul Reaver 2 when you find out that Kain isn't actually the bad guy. He just didn't want to kill all the vampires by killing himself because he was the last vampire. It gets a little complex, but it's not in a bad way. Like, Soul Reaver 2 was fantastic, as was the first. But then Blood Omen 2 came out, and it wasn't quite as good as Soul Reaver and Soul Reaver 2. Soul Reaver 2 causes history to rearrange itself, and Blood Omen 2 follows Kain in an alternate timeline that was caused by Soul Reaver 2, and you get the idea that it's starting to get a little bit needlessly complex, isn't it? Like, it's not a bad game by any means, but it kind of abandoned some of the progress that was made in the Soul Reaver games with the type of gameplay that they were doing. And a lot of this is because the Soul Reaver team had nothing to do with this, and the development of Blood Omen 2 actually started with the development of Soul Reaver. So it's a little complex behind the scenes, too. Legacy of Kain Defiance was the last real Legacy of Kain game. In this one, you play as both Kain and Raziel, the protagonists from Soul Reaver, and it functionally is the sequel to Soul Reaver. It was definitely better than Blood Omen 2, but it wasn't quite as good as the other Soul Reaver games. Some of the effects were a little odd, too. It was kind of an attempt to unify the two series by both the teams, and it was almost there. I don't want to say that it was bad. It was actually pretty good, but it didn't do as well as any of the other games. Then they decided to make a Legacy of Kain free-to-play multiplayer game that was not good. They had an open beta in 2015 and 16, and it never made it to not open beta. The less said about that game, the better. At number 6 is the Sly Cooper series, which was a platforming game that was 3D, and by the time the original one came out in 2002, people were kind of like, another 3D platforming game? But then it turned out to be a platform stealth game, and great. I remember being skeptical of it at the time, and then playing it and be like, holy crap, this is different, in a good way. The original 3 games were really enjoyable games. They had a really unique visual style that actually, even though they were cel-shaded and that was quite a trend at the time, had a unique look to them. The original was kind of a sleeper hit, didn't initially do that good, but then started selling more and eventually became a Sony Greatest Hits title. Sly 2 and 3 did a lot better, and then there was a pretty long wait before the next game came out. Now, Sly Cooper Thieves in Time was not developed by Sucker Punch Studios, and Thieves in Time was actually the least critically well-received of the games. Also, people generally were comparing it to a series from a long time ago, and sometimes the nostalgia glasses, I think, wreck people's ability to really look at something for what it is. And Thieves in Time is a great game. People, I think, agree with that more now. It's kind of wild they haven't made another one, because Thieves in Time was actually a really well-selling game. But they haven't. And number 5 is Prototype, which is just this, like, the story isn't even relevant. It's this crazy open-world action game where you have all of these powers, and it's just like a ton of destruction and mayhem. It's almost like if somebody played Grand Theft Auto, went on a rampage, and was like, but what if you were also a shape-shifting monster? The first prototype game is probably the better of the two, not necessarily because its destruction mechanics are the best of the two, but it's kind of just put together better. It's a more interesting story, it kind of works a little bit more. Prototype 2 is, like I said, as a destruction simulator, way better. Every aspect of it is ramped up, but the story is maybe not as interesting. Everybody's a little bit too nihilistic to get too invested in them, but that doesn't mean it's not a fantastic game. It didn't sell as well as Activision wanted it to, though. It actually sold decent, but they invested apparently way more in it than they got back, and they laid off a bunch of staff, and we haven't heard anything about Prototype since. And number 4 is Darkstalkers, a fighting game series that really we haven't seen a actual real entry in since Vampire Savior 2, Lord of the Vampire, in 1997. Yes, that's a hilarious title. Now this game is constantly put out in collections, and it got an HD remaster back in 2013. There's a fair amount of people who simply know Darkstalkers as the game that Morrigan is from, because she's pretty much a meme at this point. Honestly, it's kind of shocking that they actually haven't made a new Darkstalkers. They claim it's because that HD remaster in 2013 didn't do great, but like, that's also almost a decade ago. I don't think those numbers would hold today. We'll see though. They always say something along the lines of Darkstalkers isn't dead. I actually do think it's a pretty good example of a fighting game, so I hope that we do see another Darkstalkers eventually as well. And number 3 is Ultima. Alright, last game in this series was Ultima 9 in 1999. It was a bad game, it was very buggy, and huge yikes. Huge yikes. That said, Ultima 7, which was not one of the originals, might we add, was considered the best in the series. Now, Ultima itself is a really, really complex RPG from way back in 1981. It's kind of the foundational RPG, like JRPGs and Western RPGs have all taken so much from Ultima. But again, that last one was god-awful, and they haven't touched it since. Which is kind of surprising, because it seems like it'd be a really easy concept to sell, at least. The complexity of Ultima combined with the amazing crap we see in today's game engines. My belief is it would really be a great game, and I hope that someday somebody does it. And number 2 is Jet Set Radio, which spawned a single sequel called Jet Set Radio Future. The original Jet Set Radio came out on the Dreamcast. The second came out on the original Xbox. So, these games still hold up. They have a really unique visual style and a really unique gameplay mechanic. I kind of like the gameplay mechanics of the original over Future, because Future made some changes in the controls that I don't love, but that doesn't make Jet Set Radio Future not a fantastic game. It is. It's absolutely a fantastic game. Both have these incredible soundtracks, this amazing world, and have a ridiculousness to them that make just like spray paint tagging graffiti stuff into like how some skate punk games take down this mega corporation is probably the most concise version of a description I can come up with for it. It is absurd and beyond fun. There has not been any mention of a new Jet Set Radio game since Jet Set Radio Future. They did port it to modern systems. You can get it on pretty much everything. Just the original Jet Set Radio, not Future, which sucks. I really wish we'd get the same treatment for Future. But at least indie developers know that there's a lot going on there. There's a game called Bomb Rush Cyberpunk coming out that is kind of a spiritual successor, and I'm really excited to play that. I'm hoping it does really well, and Sega goes, oh yeah, that's right, people like these games. And finally, at number 1, it's SimCity. SimCity is really a casualty of the video gaming industry. EA particularly. You all know what EA does to companies. They buy them and destroy them, and then blame them for the destruction, and then retain their IP, and then nothing else happens. That's the case of SimCity. Remember SimCity 2013? You can't even list the problems with SimCity 13. It was a 3D SimCity. Now that wasn't the problem. The problem was all of the various awful things about it. Always on, weird cloud stuff that didn't work, And when I say stuff that didn't work, I'm probably doing a lot to underemphasize just how much didn't work. People had every reason to hate SimCity 2013. There's no argument there. But, like, between SimCity 2000, which is a near-perfect game, the original SimCity, which is a very interesting game, the Super Nintendo version of SimCity, which Nintendo imprinted itself onto and made this really charming version of SimCity, there's stuff in SimCity's history that is just among the best games of all time. It would be nice if we got another one that just decided, hey, let's make a game that plays just like SimCity 2000, but that looks incredible. That's what I'd like. Maybe a few new gameplay things, like new buildings, but not stuff that messes up the formula. That's one that I don't know if I'm ever going to see, because it just seems like they don't even mention SimCity anymore. The last thing that came out called SimCity was called SimCity Build It, which was kind of like a crappy free-to-play for phones, and yeah, it was still actually better than SimCity 2013. It really wouldn't be hard to make something better than SimCity 2013. But, like, all you have to do is make a real successor to SimCity 2000 that looks amazing. That's it! That's all you gotta do!